school for all the kids and Teen Warriors, if you want to head.
To put that date aside on the 2nd of April in the evening for Sam Childers. He is coming. He's got an interesting testimony, and his theme is, if God can use me in this way, he can use anyone. So if you've got people who normally wouldn't go to church, then it's an opportunity to invite them to come along. So take it and just have a look at it, but invite your friends. There will be an offering taken up to assist Sam's work, so just come prepared for that as well. And the challenge newspaper, we still have a few there, and I have got another 5,000 arrived during the week for next month already. So if you know of people or shops that would like to be able to put them out, then please see me. Today, we're still continuing our series in the book of, can anyone remember it? What was it? Okay. We're going to continue on this thought of what it means. Am I moving towards God, or am I moving away from him in my relationship? Because this was a man who only God raised up, Haggai, and he was given 3 months, just 3 months ministry to get the people to get up to scratch or get back on direction. And the problem was that they had been away in basically captivity for 70 years. They came back and they started eagerly rebuilding. They rebuilt, they laid the temple foundations, and then they had a few hassles, and so 16 years had passed since any work had been done on the temple. And during that time, the people had spent all their time, effort and money on making the houses not just comfortable but extraordinary and extravagant. And they had forgot about God, and it was very easy to be able to do. And that's where we left it, where Haggai was called to bring them back, to heal, to get them to understand what are their priorities. And this morning we pick it up in these verses, a producing of poverty. And I thought this was interesting. I wonder how many here today can relate to making heaps of money, but it never seems to last long. It always seems to, everything costs more. And well, I'm sure someone would miss it. But today, we seem to, we do more work, but it doesn't seem to last long. Now, I'm giving away my age here, but how many can remember a bottle of Coke, a 600ml bottle of Coke costing threepence? Oh, come on, there's people my age here, I'm sure. Or you can't remember when it was threepence. All right, what about if I said it was 5 cents? Well, you've missed out on the best years of your life, because it certainly doesn't cost you that, it costs you a lot more now to buy those things. But what I'm saying is things change. And often we think by having a lot more money, we're able to buy this and we're able to buy that, but we find out that it doesn't work that way. We find that the more money we make, the less that it seems to go that far, and we always seem to be playing catch up. We've got this idea, we'll save for a holiday, we'll save for our retirement, and something always seems to come up that eats away at those savings. And of course, this causes a sense of frustration, maybe disappointment, and if we allow it, it causes us to spiral down into the slope of depression, because we can't understand why things are not changing, why we're not making some sort of headway, It's as though we're sitting, spinning our wheels and getting nowhere at all. And God's message today is just for us. And the first thing he says is this, the consideration in verses 5 and 7. This is what the Lord All-Powerful says, think about what you have done. Very simple. But what he's saying is, I want you to pay close attention to what I'm saying. And I'm going to repeat it 3 times so you don't miss it, so you don't understand it, that the message is very simple and very clear. You need to stop what you're doing. You need to reevaluate your priorities and the things you're doing before it's too late to change anything. And God is saying to his people, I want a personal relationship with you. I want your heart. And I really want to bless you. I'm prepared, though, to shake your life up in a way that you've never experienced before. Now understand, I will not play second fiddle to anyone or anything in your life. And that's important for us as God's people. God's not going to play second fiddle. In 520 BC, this was a situation that God's people found themselves in. They'd become indifferent. They'd become comfortable and complacent. If you like, they were vegetating. They were not going forwards or backwards. They were just getting comfortable. And they couldn't or wouldn't get out of this state. And to do something to change the direction in which they were going, it's just too hard. They become so accustomed to what they were doing, they didn't want to change. They just wanted it to continue the way that it always has. They accepted their situation. They accepted what was happening to them as what is the new norm. And after experiencing what we had with COVID, life is not exactly the same. When we're in COVID, we're waiting for everything to get back to normal. Has it gone back to normal? Is it just the way it was? Or is there slight changes? Now, if I go, what would you say? Even I continued to cough, would you say, Pastor, you should go home. You should stay in your room. You should get checked out to see whether you've got COVID because you shouldn't spread. You should wear a mask. Because that's what we've been conditioned that the new norm is. This is what people do. This is how we're to live now. And it was no different for God's people. Because they felt they couldn't do anything to change. Didn't matter that they didn't want to change. But they also felt they hadn't heard from God and that God had somehow just abandoned them to their own whatever they were to do. Now understand that when you allow a habit to become a dominant force in your life, you don't want it to change because it becomes your security. And this is a process in which we play an active role to allow ourselves to come to the place where I don't care what people say, I don't care what people think, I don't care what people do. Whatever becomes the new norm. Whatever. And you meet people like that. I've met people in management that will just say, whatever, I don't really care. I'm not listening to you, I'm not paying attention. You know what? When we get tired, when we get weary, when we're worn out, we don't want to do anything. And you know, it's easier to go with the flow, and that's the truth of it. Don't fight against it. Don't swim against it. Go with the flow. And in this case, they'd gone with the flow for 16 years. They hadn't touched the temple foundations. They were content. Whatever. We got plenty of time. We'll get round to it someday. Well, we're not so busy. It's not my priority. My priority right now is looking after myself and my house. But this is much more than an issue about the temple. It's an issue about allowing our personal relationship with God to drift. You know, just drift merrily along. We don't have energy. We're not motivated. We're happy to be seen, to be doing the right thing, but we don't want to get involved in ministry. We're worn out, we're tired and weary. We get to the point where we just don't care. We just go through the motions. We drift along doing whatever we can do as long as it doesn't require much of us. And often we think in those times, where is God? Why has he abandoned me? The reality is God hasn't abandoned us at all. It's we who have turned our backs on him. We have made a decision we don't need him anymore. And we're saying, fine, thank you, we don't need you any much. And we justify our actions by saying to the Lord, look, Lord, I know you're there. Let's have an agreement. You do your thing and I'll do mine. If I need you, I'll call you. Until then, leave me alone. I don't want to hear from you. And you might think, Pastor, Christians don't do that. They don't think like that. Well, I've got news for you. They do. They do. This is a breakdown in a relationship. A relationship that Christians have with God. We're still God's people. But what happens is we're out of fellowship with each other because of some, well, it could be a sin, it could be our attitude, and we just don't have a desire to do anything for God anymore. What's God going to do about it? Now, if it was me, if I was God, and I'm glad I'm not, I probably would have said, well, you mob, I'm disowning you. Get on and do your own thing. I don't care what you do anymore. I want nothing more to do with you. Well, that's not the God of the Bible. That's not how he thinks. That's not what he does. But let's talk about relationships a little bit this morning. As Christians, do we have a relationship with God? How do we maintain that relationship? And that's the challenge. I want those of you who are married just to stop and think for a moment. Remember back to the big day? The anticipation of it all? When, as a groom, you looked and you saw your beautiful wife-to-be coming down that aisle, you thought, wow. And of course, as a wife, future wife, you came down, you looked at your husband and saw, what a bloke, how handsome he is. And then you decided that you were going to say your vows and you were going to live happily ever after. Now, I'm not saying you're not living happily ever after, don't get me wrong. But we made a lot of promises on that day. And we started out working on that wonderful journey together. And then I guess the reality of what we said gave us a rude awakening. Now, what do I mean by that? When your partner, when your spouse did something to hurt you, did something to annoy you, maybe it's what they said, maybe it's the way they said it, and as a result, this caused friction in your relationship. Now, what has happened to your relationship right now? Do you still have one? Yes or no? Are you still married? Yes, you are. Always got to be one. The relationship is marred right now at this point. Because what happens when there's friction and conflict, you didn't speak to one another. You gave each other the cold shoulder. You only spoke to your partner when you had to. Yet you still remained in your status as husband and wife. That hasn't changed. That conflict, that cold shoulder moment hasn't affected your marital, it hasn't voided it. But your fellowship with each other became distant. And it remained that way until you decided to confront and deal with the issue. You sorted it out before you could come back into fellowship, into a right relationship with one another. But until you decided to deal with it, there was that distance. Your relationship, even though you were married, was marred. The relationship can be said the same for a parent and children. When parents and children have a disagreement, it doesn't change the fact that you're still a parent and you still have children. But that closeness of the relationship is marred until things are changed. And this is what is happening here in our text. God's people's spiritual indifference towards him in what they were doing resulted in that relationship being marred, being strained. They gave God the cold shoulder. Now, when a person becomes a Christian through faith in Jesus Christ, they're placed into the family of God. I want us to understand, you do not put yourself into the family of God. Only God does that. You and I cannot make ourselves a Christian and then decide, I'm going to unmake myself as a Christian. That's not your job. God is the only one that can do that. You don't decide, I'm going to become a Christian, and the next day, I'm not going to become a Christian. That is not your job, and that is not what happens. When you become a Christian for all eternity, and you become part of God's family. He places you and me into his family, and that's where we stay. That relationship is never dissolved and it's never broken because we belong to God for all eternity. And this is where I find a lot of Christians have problems understanding this relationship. Now, when I choose to do the wrong thing, when I choose to go my own way, then this breaks my fellowship with God. What happens is I give him the cold shoulder. I treat him with indifference. And it stays that way until I repent of what I'm doing and I'm brought back into fellowship. I do not lose my salvation. I lose my fellowship with God. The same as a husband and wife when they have a conflict. It doesn't change their relationship. They're still married. But it changes the way that they deal with one another in everyday life until they fix the problem. And it's the same in the Christian life. If I want to do my own thing and I'm saying, God, just leave me alone, I'm going my own way, then that relationship is strained and it needs to be fixed. And so that's what happens when I break my fellowship with God. God seems so distant and so far away that it's as though he doesn't care about me anymore. And that's what I think in my relationship. Even though I've wanted to go my own way and do my own thing, I'm blaming God for it. And maybe this morning, you're sitting here as a Christian saying you feel that God is distant from you, that you've lost the sense of God's nearness to you. You've lost that sense of love that you once enjoyed with him. Is your fellowship with the Lord, is it what it used to be, or has it changed? Do you find that you can't speak to the Lord as you once did because that relationship is strained, it's marred, it's not close? Does there seem to be some sort of barrier between you and him? If so, maybe it's because there's some sin in your life that you've been unwilling to deal with. Maybe you're just like the people in Haggai's day. You've fallen into a state of spiritual indifference over the past week, the past month, the past years, and God seems to be moving further and further away from you. And you know what? You've reached a place where I don't care. I don't care what people think or people say. I am going to do my own thing. And God, I don't want to know you anymore. You've let me down, and I'm having nothing more to do with you. You don't do anything for me anyway. I can't sense your presence. Maybe you've become less disciplined in your Christian life. In other words, I don't bother going to church anymore. I don't want to read the Bible anymore. I don't pray. What's the point? And I'm going to let it rip and tell you what I think, and I'm going to live my life the way I want without any restrictions. Maybe you've allowed other things to become more important to you. They take preference in your life over the things of God and the work of God. Maybe over the past year or the number of years, you've been slowly but surely pushing God away. He's no longer the centre of your life where he should be and where he wants to be. He's on the fringes. He's on the peripheral. You've got to the point where you give God the leftovers. Whatever I feel like giving him, that's it. I'm not going to give him the best. I'm not going to give him what I want. I want to do what I want to do. Is there any sense, any wonder that there's a loss of sense of communion and personal fellowship with God? Your relationship is not what it used to be. It's no wonder that you feel that God is distant from you, because your relationship with him is marred. Maybe it's because of some sin. Maybe it's because of some attitude. Maybe it's because you reached the point where you don't care. And so God isn't close to you. God is distant. God seems to be giving you the cold shoulder. And this is what the people were feeling. This is what indifference does. We don't care. We reach a point in our life where we just go through those motions. We do what's expected and nothing more. But don't ask me to do anything more. I'm happy with where I'm at. And this is where God's people were at the present time. This is why God raised this man up just to give 4 sermons over 3 months. Not long, but boy, did he give them what for. Then there's the confirmation in verse 6 and 7. You've planted much, but you harvest little. You eat, but you do not become full. You drink, but you're still thirsty. You put on clothes, but you're not warm enough. You earn money, but you lose it all as if you put it into a purse full of holes. This is what the Lord all-powerful says. Think about what you've done. Now, the prophet's message is pretty blunt. If this is the way you're going to treat God, and you believe that you can do it and not suffer any consequences, I've got news for you, and you better wake up. There are consequences. You reap what you sow. And in this verse 6 of our text, what we're told is God began to remove material possessions. He hit their agriculture. He says, you plant a lot, but you get very little for doing it. very little in the harvest. Now, God's people were dependent upon agriculture to provide for the good harvest for themselves, also for the nation's economy. In other words, to provide a comfortable lifestyle for everyone. However, things were not going their way for a number of years. Sure, they'd seen many good harvests. They'd put everything they had into turning things around to ensure that they would get a good harvest. They'd done all the right things. They ploughed the ground each year. They prepared the seed for sowing. But nothing seemed to work. That bumper harvest never seemed to materialise because the rains, which were expected, didn't come. As a result, there were famine and droughts. There was nothing to fall back on. God says, you expected much. Turned out very little for all your efforts. God then hit their economy. They were not making enough wages to meet their daily needs. They worked hard, but had very little to show for it. Instead of bountiful harvest, they had more and more droughts. More and more droughts plunged the economy into chaos and hardship. Yet before this, the people had experienced good harvests. They'd built up a nest egg, a contingency plan, if you like, when things went bad. That's good planning. They'd built substantial bank balances, and this gave them a false sense of security in the economy. They thought, well, this is the way that things are always going to be, and they didn't want them to change. And so, thinking that things were going to be the same forever and ever, they spent their contingency funds in luxuries and soon found out everything dried up. They dried up due to that magic little word called inflation, something we're getting more and more of today. Right now, God's people were in survival mode. They had very little to show for all their hard work. They couldn't make things stretch far enough the way they used to. Times were tough. Inflation began to bite. Any money they had was gone. It was as if they put their money in their pockets only to find that they had holes in it. This is what inflation does to the economy if it's left unchecked. People have to pay exorbitant prices on necessities just to survive. There wasn't enough food to go around, not enough water. Everything was scarce and in short supply. Had to be rationed because of the time. And we're told in our text, even the clothes they had worn were worn out, were not able to provide them with the protection they needed. For years, they'd put all their effort into working hard to give themselves a comfortable lifestyle. They built beautiful houses for themselves, saving up their excess income each year and so on. But in a few short years, it ended, and there were poverty and in want. Everything was gone. The barns were empty. Their fields were empty. Their wells were dry. What was happening? Why was it happening? When God was consigned to the back burner of most people's lives, they couldn't or wouldn't see that it was God who caused what was happening to them. They just didn't see that God was responsible. They didn't understand this could have been resolved if they had dealt with their indifference towards Him, if they'd made things right. But they were stubborn, they were resistant, and so this is why they're in that position. And the prophet is saying to them, God wants your attention. He wants you to listen. Has He done enough to wake you up and stir you up? To realise that in this relationship, it's not a one-sided relationship. where you take and take and take and give nothing in return. And God is saying, what are your priorities? What is it that you really want in life? If it's in material possessions, if it's investing in the economy, then think again. Because I control in these areas as I control in all other areas of life. And he's saying, think carefully about these things. And that's something, a message for us today, because things have been great up till the last few years. Everything has much continued the same way as it has. Good wages, good opportunities, more money than we've ever had before, much more than the generations prior. And now we're seeing it's all being eaten up very quickly. The opportunities are not there. And God is maybe saying to us today, what's your priorities? Is it in what you can get, what you can save, what you can put aside? Is that what your interest is? And you think you can push me to the side and say, I'll get by without you. Well, I'm telling you, I'm in control of these things as well. And you're going to find that out. Then he says in verse 8, go up to the mountains, bring back wood, build the temple, then I'll be pleased with it and be honoured, says the Lord. You see, God has a solution for most of the problems that we experience in life. He always does. And basically he's saying, if you get your priorities in order, if you take the time to consider the importance of my house, if you take the time to consider your relationship with me, that it's genuine, that it's real, that it's something that you want, then you'll find that this circumstances, this situation that you're in, can be remedied very quickly. Now, God wasn't asking them to build this temple without providing them with the resources to do so. He's simply saying, look at what you've done, look at how you've spent everything that you've been given, and look by comparison to my house, which represents my being and my presence among you. Look at the difference. Do I really matter to you? Am I a priority? Is there a relationship with me even? He says, my house is in ruins. But you know what? There's plenty of wood in the mountains. There are plenty of resources for you to get the job done. It would please me greatly if you got the relationship back on track, if you put your time, your energy and effort into building my house. So often we look at life and we make it harder than what we need to. God does not ask us to do some humongous task alone. He simply wants us to comply with his will. He doesn't change with what he wants or what he wants us to do. That's always the same. He supplied the resources for them to build the temple. He will supply the same for us. He just wants us to take what he's already given and get busy. We need and we know what we need to do, and we know how to do it. We just need to get busy working it. Now he gives what I call a principal proof here of what he's saying. When God says, I'm in control, he's about to show them how he's in control. You look for much, but you find little. When you bring it home, I destroy it. Why, ask the Lord all powerful? Because you all work hard for your own houses, while my house is still in ruins. God told them very clearly the reason for the droughts, the reasons for the famine, the reason for inflation. God is not blessing them with the abundance that they were used to because of their indifference towards him. Now, please don't get me wrong. I'm not preaching a prosperity gospel here. name it and claim it and it's all yours. I'm not saying that at all. What I am saying is that God's in control of the weather. He's in control of the climate. And our text is actually telling us this. And God is saying to them, I'll tell you why you're having your current problems. It's because of your attitude and your actions towards me. You put yourself first and me second. For all these years, you've allowed my house to be in ruins because you don't care. And oh yes, I've heard all your excuses that you make. You keep telling me they're legitimate, that they're justified. But I need to remind you again, the reason you are back in the land is to rebuild the temple. For the past 16 years, you procrastinated about doing it. Remember that word, procrastinating? Put off, put off, put off, put off. For 16 years, they put off rebuilding. You say, we'll get to it soon, while you prioritise what you want to do instead. I've had enough of your excuses. I've had enough of being given the cold shoulder. I've had enough of this relationship being one-way traffic, all your direction. Enough is enough. So I've taken away my blessing on you and the nation because of what you've done. I'm going to give you a taste of your own medicine. You'll understand this is how you treated me. I have shut up the heavens so you'll not get more rain. You'll not get a drop of water while my house stands in ruin. Your land will experience the same. God is saying this is a fact. It's a hard pill for them to swallow, a pill to swallow for God's people. To know that they're responsible for their current situation. Now that's pretty hard to accept. Me being responsible for what is happening? How could that be? And God is saying because of your indifference in the relationship, you say, I'm your God. You say, we're God's special people, and yet this is the way you show it? I want you to think about it. The concern. Because of what you've done, the sky holds back its rain and the ground holds back its crop. I've called for a time without rain on the land and on the mountains and on the grain, the new wine, the olive oil, the plants which the earth produces, the people, the farm animals, and all the work of your houses. What God is saying here, make no mistake, I'm responsible for all that's happening to you. I've stopped the land from producing any crops. I've caused the land to become as hard as iron. I have chosen not to bless you with the wonderful bounty of good things. Instead, I'm giving you hardship and suffering so that I can get your attention and show you these things cannot be replaced. Think about who I am and what I do. You might be thinking at this moment, well, hang on a minute, God, that's just not fair. It's just not fair. But make no mistake, God had already warned them. If this was the direction, if this was the path they were going to take, they only had themselves to blame. You might say, well, what? No, I didn't put it up. But if you look at Leviticus 26, 19 and 20, it says, I'll break your great pride. I will make the sky like iron and the earth like bronze. You'll work hard, but it will not help. Your land will not grow any crops. Your trees will not give their fruit. This is what they were told in Leviticus. And again in Deuteronomy 28, 20 to 24. The Lord will send you curses, confusion and punishment in everything you do. You'll be destroyed and suddenly ruined because you did wrong when you left him. The Lord will give you terrible diseases, destroy you from the land you're going to take. The Lord will punish you with disease, fever, swelling, heat, lack of rain, plant diseases, mildew until you die. The sky above will be like bronze, and the ground below will be like iron. The Lord will turn the rain into dust and sand, which will fall from the skies until you are destroyed. Who's to blame? God or themselves? They were warned. Plenty of warning. But they didn't pay any attention. And I wonder if we're any different. We read the Bible, we look at it and say, oh, that doesn't apply to me, and we just live every day without paying any attention to what God has to say. Yet God wants this relationship to be a two-way street. He did promise the people, though, if you follow me, this is what will happen. In Deuteronomy 11:13-15, he says, if you carefully obey the commands I'm giving you today and love your God and serve him with your whole being, then he will send rain on your land at the right time, in the fall and in the spring, and you'll be able to gather your grain, your new wine and oil. He will put grass in the fields for your cattle, and you'll have plenty to eat. You see, the people ignored this part of their relationship. They didn't make God a priority. They didn't care about God or what he had to say anymore, and they were experiencing everything that they're experiencing now because they weren't interested. They were only interested in doing what they wanted. It was my life, I'm going to live it whatever way I choose, and I'm going to do it. I don't need you anymore. It wasn't as though they didn't know. They walked past the temple foundation for 16 years. I'm sure there's a guilty conscience that said, whoa, how long has it been since we did anything on that? Don't worry about it. Now they're getting a dose of reality. The whole world didn't revolve around themselves and what they wanted to do. They didn't like what was happening. And you know what? And I guess it's pretty hard when you've got pride. It's hard to hand over control and admit you've lost control. Even though you don't like other people pulling the strings, telling you what to do, telling you how to do it. They're being told, God said, this is happening because in this relationship that you agreed with, you would love me and serve me. Then you've said, no, I don't want anything to do with you. And you went your own way thinking, hey, there's no consequences. Let's do it. It's God who controls the wind, the rain and the sunshine. He determined that the clouds would not gather over Palestine. He determined the rain wouldn't fall. He had determined that the sun would shine brilliantly in the sky from morning until night. You know, one of the things that I find interesting in this climate control debate, God's never mentioned. It's man who thinks he can control the climate. Yet the scriptures tell me very clearly, it's God who makes the sun to shine. It's God who makes it to rain. I can say, rain now. Guess what? Nothing happens. Why? I'm not God. But the scriptures tell us God is the one that controls all of these elements. Now God wants to bless his people, but his children had become indifferent, had become complacent in their attitudes and their conduct. They put themselves first. They pushed their own interests. They pushed God into the background. God often responds not only by withholding his blessing, but by actively disciplining those he loves. He does so, not because he's cruel, but because he wants to get us back on track spiritually, so that he can do what he does. And what he does, he blesses his children. And sometimes he uses a heavy hand upon us for us to take time and reevaluate our priorities. And this may include removing spiritual blessing from us It could be that he takes our job from us, that we live on a much reduced income. Maybe a person has been used to having a well-paid job, maybe even having two wages that come in to the home. And during that time, they were able to buy whatever they wanted without a second thought. They had the ability to save quite a bit each year, the ability to afford a holiday and so on. And even though God had been greatly blessing them materially, they were not giving God the primary place in his life that he demanded. So God withdraws that blessing. Suddenly, people's circumstances changed. They find they're made redundant. Things begin to tighten up financially, and they struggle to make ends meet. They dip into the savings that they have to pay the bills to survive. Or God could withhold the blessing of health. After many years of good health, people suddenly find themselves overcome with one medical problem after another. We have a problem, no sooner does that clear up than we find something else is wrong with us. And yes, the doctors can investigate and tell us the reason that why this is part and happening to our anatomy and why it isn't functioning. But maybe there's another reason that's behind it if I'm a Christian. Maybe I have become indifferent towards God. Maybe I have some sin in my life that I'm not prepared to acknowledge. And God is bringing us to the point, he's shaking us up to say, what do we really want in life? What do we really value in our relationships? God called his people to give serious thought to what was happening to them, to weigh up, I am responsible for what's happening in your life. Give careful thought to your ways. And God is speaking to them in a language that they understood. He's hitting them where they are, where their priorities are. He's hitting them where it hurts. And they needed to listen to him. And maybe God has been speaking to someone here today in the same way. Maybe you have not been putting God first in your life. Maybe you've said, hey, I'm a Christian, but you haven't lived as a Christian. You're not as committed to God and his service as you should be. And maybe God has touched your life, withholding a blessing from you and brought some adversity, some trouble, some hardship into your life to get your attention. Maybe you've reached the point sometimes, as I have, why is this happening in my life right now? Why have I been hit with such hard times? Why have I got these problems? God doesn't allow his children to go their own way unchecked. He'll make a point of dealing with them to bring them back to himself. This is what God was doing in the lives of his people. It wasn't pleasant, it wasn't painful. Did they learn? Well, I'm going to leave it there. I could go on, but I'm not going to. Because I want us to think about, what is my priority when it comes to God? Is it to the point in my relationship that I just don't care anymore? That God is so distant that I feel he's not interested in me? Then maybe he's shaken your life up. Maybe he's brought something into your life that says, I want your attention. I care enough about you to want to put you in the right direction. And maybe there's some issues that we have to deal with. God's people were challenged about their priorities. Maybe he's doing the same about you and me this morning. What are our priorities? What is our relationship with God really like? Is it one-sided, or does it have a reciprocal direction in which it flows? We want the blessing, we don't want the pain and the suffering. God wants to bless us, but he wants us in a right relationship. It's not one-sided.